Hi students, this is the Chapter 7 lecture on proteins, just in case I don't have enough time to get through it all in class. So Chapter 7 is all about proteins, proteins being the third of the three macronutrients, carbohydrates, lipids or fats, and proteins. Okay, and what the macronutrients all have in common, of course, is that we need them in large amounts and that they all give us energy. Though you'll see in this lecture that proteins really are the least, their least important role is in giving us energy. Although they do provide energy, we don't get a whole lot of energy from them. We really rely more on carbohydrates and fats for that. So what are the different functions of proteins? What do we need them for if we don't really use them that much for energy and their macronutrients? Well, there's a lot of different roles for them. I have lots of little pictures of those different roles here, but let's walk through them one by one. So the first and foremost important role for proteins in the diet is for growth and development and maintenance of cells and tissues in our bodies. So when you're growing, anytime in your life period that you go through a period of growth, so when you're a child and you're going through growth spurts, when you are pregnant and you are growing another person inside you, if you do a lot of strength training and you're building muscle, okay, all of those are different types of growth. All of those require protein to build new cells, build new tissues. Also, if you injure yourself, that healing process, the growth of new tissue, of scar tissue, involves protein. So it's necessary during that as well. Even when you're not growing, your body is still, it's not this static thing that just kind of stays the same all the time. There's a lot of turnover that's going on that you're not necessarily aware of. Cells in your intestine, cells in your blood cells only live for a few weeks, then they die off and you make new ones. So you're constantly sort of regenerating new blood cells and discarding the old ones. Same thing with your skin cells. On your skin, the outer layer of your skin is actually just dead skin cells that serve as sort of a protective wall. And those skin cells are constantly sloughing off. There's some statistic, I never remember the percentage, but some ridiculous amount of dust. If you find like dust bunnies in the corner of your room, most of that dust is actually dead skin cells, composed of dead skin cells. So lots of skin cells shedding and turning over all the time. So that requires protein as well, making new cells that have to turn over. And also structural proteins. Your hair and nails are protein. They're there's no cellular material. They're not cells. They're just protein, which is why it doesn't hurt when you cut them. And they are composed of structural protein called keratin. Keratin is the major protein that makes up your hair and nails. Also in your skin, there's a structural protein called collagen, which helps give your skin that tautness so you don't get wrinkles. So that's the most important reason for or job of proteins is growth and development. Another important function of proteins is as enzymes and hormones. All of the enzymes in your body are proteins. And what is an enzyme? Hopefully you remember this from, I think it was Chapter 3. Enzymes are molecules that speed up chemical reactions. And in the context of nutrition, we often talk about the digestive enzymes, lipases, amylases, proteases, okay? All of the different enzymes that break down our macromolecules, our macronutrients. And they are all composed of protein. So without enzymes, you'd probably be able to digest food without enzymes, but it would take you thousands of years. With enzymes, we've shortened the time of those chemical processes like, thousandfold. So enzymes are really important in being able to digest food. There's also a lot of other different types of enzymes in the body that we don't discuss in this class, but there are enzymes, multiple enzymes in every cell for every function, every chemical reaction pretty much in the body. So enzymes are important. Hormones are also important. Hormones are chemical messengers. It means they're secreted by one gland and then they travel through the blood to some other part of the body to send a signal. So a good example of some hormones, some protein hormones that we've talked about in this class are insulin and glucagon, two classic hormones that are secreted by the pancreas, yet they signal the brain, or they signal cells, I should say. They signal cells to take up glucose or to release glucose, and those can be cells anywhere within the body. So not just cells within the pancreas. The pancreas secretes them, they travel throughout the body and tell cells to either take up glucose or release glucose. Another example here on this slide is human growth hormone, which is also a protein hormone. What are some other hormones that we've talked about that are not made out of proteins but are maybe made out of lipids? The sex hormones, anyone remember those? Derived from cholesterol, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, all of those come from sterols, are derived from cholesterol. So there are some hormones that are lipid-based, that come from lipids, but many of them do come from proteins as well. Another role for proteins is in fluid balance and pH balance. So remember, our body's constantly trying to achieve a state of homeostasis, sort of a happy baseline, okay? Blood sugar levels, blood pressure, blood sodium levels, blood fluid levels, okay? And also the pH. pH is measured by levels of hydrogen ion, this H plus molecule. So proteins, there's a protein in the blood called albumin, which really exists there to play a role in fluid balance. So the water is attracted to this albumin protein. So as long as there's albumin in the blood, water gets pulled out of tissues and into the blood and then can be used to make urine. If you don't have enough protein in the blood, you can't attract that water out of the tissues, and so water pools or collects in the tissues and leads to swelling, which is called edema. So here's a picture of a leg that is suffering from edema or swelling, and then the healthy normal leg, other leg. So edema can be unpleasant and can be a sign of low protein intake, or some other, like kidney disease, other conditions that reduce your protein levels. Proteins also act as good buffers. They help soak up these hydrogen ions, so they help reduce the acidity of the blood. They also can absorb the basic ions. So they're excellent buffers. They help to balance the pH. We're talking about amino acids. Amino acids act as excellent buffers. Another important role for proteins are as part of the immune system. So antibodies, the antibodies that your immune cells make when you get infected with a bacteria or a virus, your immune cells start producing antibodies that then coat the bacteria and tag them for destruction by macrophages and other cells of the immune system. So these antibody-producing cells, the antibodies that are actually produced, those are proteins. Antibodies are made from protein. So if you don't have any protein, you can't make antibodies, and that would severely disable your immune system. Number 5, proteins are very important for transport of various nutrients. So some of the examples we've already talked about in previous chapters. In the transport of fats, proteins contribute to those lipoproteins that we talked about. And there's 4 types of lipoproteins: chylomicrons, VLDL, LDL, and HDL particles. All of them are lipoproteins, so they're made up of lipid and proteins. So that helps transport our fats. Also, other fat-soluble vitamins can be transported in these vesicles. So it transports nutrients through the blood via lipoproteins. Also, proteins are important for helping transport nutrients in and out of cells. So here's a snippet from a previous slide in the carbohydrate lecture when we were talking about insulin and glucagon, regulating the uptake of glucose. Because here you have this purple molecule here. I don't know why it's coincidental, I guess, that the proteins in both of these pictures are purple. So these little knobs off the lipoprotein, those represent the proteins. But these are transporters in cell membranes that allow glucose in or out of the cell. So there's a lot of different nutrients that get in and out of the cell through some kind of protein transporter. So not only does protein help us to transport nutrients through the blood, it also helps us to transport nutrients into and out of the cells, across cell membranes. Okay? And then here it is, the last role, number 6. The last thing we use proteins for is for energy. And it really is sort of the last resort for energy. We really go to carbohydrates and fats first when we need energy. And if we run out of those two things, then we start breaking down proteins. So we don't store proteins like we store carbohydrates and we store fats for energy. Really, we use proteins, and whatever proteins we're not using, we mostly get rid of. So we don't have like extra stores of them for things. Also, when we use proteins for energy, we actually can't metabolize amino acids to make ATP. It's not like, okay, we can break down amino acid and make ATP. We actually have to turn the amino acid into glucose or a triglyceride, and then break those down to make ATP. So that's, I guess there is actually a sideways pathway to turn amino acids into ATP, but it's not very efficient. So usually amino acids to give us energy are converted to glucose by that process called gluconeogenesis, which literally means the new generation or generation of new glucose. So last role, minor role for protein is energy. How much energy does 1 gram of protein provide? Hopefully you said 4 calories. 4 calories per gram is how much it provides. So, what are proteins? Chemically, what are they? So now we know why they're important for our bodily functions, but what exactly do they look like? So proteins, similar to carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, remember, are long chains of glucose molecules strung together, or branches of them. Proteins, similarly, are long chains of the building block called amino acid. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And when you link them together in long chains, they're called polypeptides. Okay? We'll talk about where that name comes from in a second. So just like carbohydrates and just like triglycerides, proteins offer us carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are the 3 major atoms or elements that are represented in our macronutrients: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Proteins, unlike fats and carbohydrates, also contain the element nitrogen. So all of the nitrogen that we need for our bodies comes from proteins. So that's something different that proteins offer us. And proteins are something that most people stereotypically associate with muscle tissue, and we think protein, muscle, protein, but it's not the only place that we store protein or that protein is important. Protein, remember all those functions that we talked about for proteins, they're important in all of our cells, and they're present in all of our cells. They are present in high amounts in muscle, and protein is very important for the development and growth of muscle, and we'll get to that at the end of this lecture. But you should keep in mind that they are actually present in all cells, in all types of tissue. So remember we said proteins, the building blocks of proteins are amino acids. And amino acids look something like this. You don't have to, I'm not going to ask you to draw the chemical structure of amino acids, but I do want you to know this. I want you to know what the different groups, chemical groups are of an amino acid. So every amino acid has a central carbon, so 1 carbon molecule in the middle, and then 4 different groups attached to that carbon molecule. One is a hydrogen, okay. The other 2 on the sides here are the amine group. This is the nitrogen-containing group. This is where the nitrogen is. And the other one is the acid group, a carboxylic acid group. So, hence the name amino acid, the amine acid, amino acid, okay, because they have an amino group and an acid group. The 4th group here, this green one, is called the side chain. And the side chain is the group that varies for each amino acid. So you can see here an example, 3 different amino acids. Each one has a different side chain. Okay? So there's 20 different amino acids total in our bodies. And they all have an amino group, an acid group, and a hydrogen. And then they each have a different side chain group. Okay, that's what makes them different. So of those 20 amino acids, some are essential and some are non-essential. Essential amino acids, of course, are ones that we do not produce, our bodies do not produce, and so we must get them from our diet. There's 9 essential amino acids, and you don't have to memorize them. I'm not going to test you on that. And there are 11 non-essential amino acids, okay? Then you have the ones here that have stars next to them. Those are the conditionally essential amino acids. So what does that mean, conditionally essential? It means that under certain circumstances, they become essential. Under certain circumstances, our body can't produce them and we have to get them from food. So an example would be of cysteine. Here, cysteine is a conditionally essential amino acid. Normally, it's not essential, our body can make it. But our body makes it from taking serine and methionine and doing some chemical acrobatics. Okay, so you need methionine and serine in order to make cysteine. Well, methionine is an essential amino acid. So if you're not eating enough methionine, if you're not getting enough methionine from your food, then you can't make cysteine. So cysteine is conditional on having enough methionine in your diet. If you're not getting methionine in your diet, then you also need to be getting cysteine in your diet. So that's an example of what it means to be conditionally essential. So like I said, you don't have to memorize which amino acids are non-essential, which amino acids are conditionally essential, etc. But I do want you to know these definitions here. What does essential, non-essential, and conditionally essential mean? Okay, so we take all these amino acids and we attach them together in these long chains that we call polypeptides. The reason we call these long chains of amino acids polypeptides is because those bonds that hold the amino acids together are called peptide bonds. So a polypeptide means many peptides, many amino acids linked together. The chemistry convention is that the term polypeptide is reserved for proteins that are, or peptides that are 50 amino acids or longer. And most of the proteins in our body are 50 amino acids or longer, so most of them are considered polypeptides. Now, in our body, like I said, we have 20 different amino acids that we use, and we can combine them in various combinations to get lots of different proteins. So I'll talk about that in a minute. So these proteins, unlike carbohydrates, so carbohydrates, you link them together and they have these long chains or long branching structures, and that's pretty much how they exist in our cells. Proteins, though, they don't just exist as these long chains of beads on a string, okay? They're these long chains that then become curled up and folded up and twisted and take on this three-dimensional conformation, a three-dimensional shape, okay? They're like a big knot. And that shape is predetermined by their sequence. So a protein, you know, every insulin protein has the same three-dimensional shape. It doesn't just curl up in some random, knot. Every single insulin protein curls up into the same exact knot. And that three-dimensional shape that it takes on is so critical to the function of that protein. A protein's function is dependent on its three-dimensional structure, okay? So the 3D shape of a protein is key. It determines its function, it determines that protein's properties, etc. So an example of a protein in the body that the structure is important is hemoglobin. So this is a diagram of a hemoglobin protein. It's actually 4 parts, 4 subunits that are all identical, and they all sort of come together. And there's 4, these red things that look like little chiclets, chewing gum, are the heme groups. Those are the iron-containing groups that bind oxygen. So hemoglobin is usually this globular shape, okay? And in normal red blood cells with normal hemoglobin, they look something like this, almost kind of like a donut. But in sickle cell anemia, people with sickle cell anemia have a mutation in the hemoglobin protein that causes them to bind together and stick together in a weird way that's not globe-like. And that actually causes the misshaped hemoglobin actually causes the whole red blood cell to become misshaped and sickled, as they say. So the shape of the protein is key. It also affects its ability to carry oxygen. So it's key to its function, key to its structure. So the first step actually in digestion of proteins is denaturing the protein. What does denaturing mean? Denaturing is when you unfold a protein. So you're not actually digesting it, you're not actually breaking it down. If you're just unfolding it, you're just opening it up, okay? And that has a special name. It's not digesting, it's denaturing, okay? So the unfolding, or another way to say that is that when a protein loses its three-dimensional structure, it becomes denatured. And there's a lot of different chemicals, a lot of different situations that can cause denaturing of a protein. One is heat. That's what's happening to these eggs right here. That's potentially what's happening to these molecules here. So when you have a raw egg, it's kind of liquidy and gelatinous, and the albumin is kind of like a clearish, yellowish color, okay? But when you fry it, it becomes white and hardened. So you're actually, it does that because you're changing the property of the protein, because you're denaturing it, okay? And denaturing proteins in food before we eat them actually helps us to digest them better. So it's a good thing. Some other things that can denature foods or denature proteins: acids. And where do we see acid in nutrition? In your stomach, maybe? Stomach acid, okay? That's actually why stomach acid is there. It's to help digest proteins by first denaturing them. Because which one, if you had a pair of scissors, which is kind of what digestive enzymes are, they're just molecular scissors that snip bonds, okay? If you had a pair of scissors and you needed to cut this into small pieces versus cutting this into small pieces, it's going to be easier to cut a long string up, because it's easier to get your scissors in, than it is to cut up a big knot, tightly folded knot. So the first thing we want to do to our proteins is denature them, and that's what stomach acid is for. So those are heavy metals, alcohol also are denaturing agents, can denature proteins. So those are a little bit about the biology of proteins, but more importantly, where do proteins come from in our body? We talk about all these important roles for proteins in growth and development and as enzymes, but where do we get all these proteins that we make in our body? Proteins in our body essentially come from our DNA, our genes, which are encoded in our DNA. And in the textbook, there's a somewhat detailed section about how DNA gets transcribed into RNA, which gets translated into protein. You don't need to know that. This is not a molecular biology class, okay? But I do want you to know that essentially this right here, that proteins come from genes. Genes in your DNA they're the blueprints for all the proteins in your body. So they encode all the proteins, like all the enzymes and the hormones and the transporters, okay, are all encoded by genes in your DNA. Now, we only have 20 different amino acids to work with in our body, yet we make thousands and thousands of tens of thousands of different proteins in our body. So I think that's kind of amazing that with a small pool of amino acids we can create so many different combinations. But it's kind of like, if you think about it, it's kind of like the English alphabet. You know, the alphabet is 26 letters, but how many words are there? There's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different words, right? Because you can take those letters and combine them in different orders for different lengths, and all of a sudden you have hundreds of thousands of different words with different meanings. Well, it's the same thing with your proteome, all the proteins in your body. You have 20 different amino acids, but you combine them in different orders and for different lengths, and you can come up with millions, probably, of different proteins. But we only have like 50,000 in our body that we know of. So we get a lot of proteins from food, and when we eat foods that have a lot of protein in them, we have to break those proteins, those polypeptides, down into amino acids that we can absorb and use to build our own proteins. Okay, so let's walk through the steps of protein digestion and absorption. Number 1, first of all, I guess number 0, notice that nothing happens to proteins in the mouth. We really don't begin protein digestion until the stomach. Okay, so in the stomach, there's 2 major things that happen. 1, you have stomach acid production, and that acid helps to denature the protein. First step of protein digestion is to unfold it, to denature it. Secondly, there's an enzyme produced by the stomach called pepsin, and pepsin helps to digest peptide bonds. So pepsin is an enzyme that digests proteins. Then we move into the small intestine, which is where most digestion and absorption occurs, right? It's like sing-song it by now. Where there's some more enzymes that come from the pancreas. That accessory organ, the pancreas, squirts in some helpful pancreatic enzymes, including these 2, trypsin and chymotrypsin, which help take those big, long polypeptides and break them down into smaller peptides and into dipeptides and tripeptides, which means 2 amino acids long or 3 amino acids long. So those di and tripeptides can actually be absorbed by our intestinal cells. The cells of the intestine can absorb those small di and tripeptides, and then inside the cell we break it down into amino acids, and then the amino acids are absorbed into the blood, step 4, and travel to, of course, the liver. All blood that comes from the intestines, it goes in the next stop in the circulation is the liver. So everything that gets absorbed from the intestines, next stop is the liver. So that includes amino acids. Whatever doesn't get absorbed in the small intestine moves into the large intestine and becomes fecal matter, but very little protein gets moved on to the large intestine. Most protein gets digested and absorbed. Same thing with fats. Most of your fat, in a normal healthy person, most fat gets broken down and digested and absorbed. So really most of your fecal matter is fiber. It's mostly fiber. Okay, so after those amino acids get absorbed, they sort of contribute to this amino acid pool that you have going on in your body. So you don't just get proteins from your diet. You do get a lot of protein from your diet, but also there's a lot of protein in your body that, enzymes and tissues and stuff, they get old. Those old red blood cells you don't need anymore. Your body just breaks them down and reuses the parts, including the proteins. So a lot of Our bodies, the protein in our body actually comes from breaking down and recycling old proteins. So we can break down and recycle old proteins by pooling those amino acids together in our amino acid pool, the ones that we have from our diet and the ones that we have from what's called our endogenous proteins, proteins within our bodies. So this whole process is called protein turnover. It's the process by which our cells recycle our proteins by breaking them down into amino acids and then using those amino acids to build new proteins, to build glucose or glycogen stores or lipid stores. We can also convert some amino acids into other amino acids as needed. So there's a lot of different uses for these amino acids, and anything that's extra or excess that we don't need, we just excrete. We either break them down for energy, or we excrete them as urine, okay? So the job of processing our amino acids is the liver's job, and also to some extent the kidneys, but mostly the liver. So all those amino acids get absorbed, taken to the liver, and if we need them, then we use them and we keep them in our amino acid pool. But if we don't need them, what happens is the liver breaks them down through this process of the chemical processes of deamination and transamination. You don't have to know these chemical processes in the detail that's mentioned in the text. Really, I just want you to know what's on this slide. I want you to know that deamination and transamination are both processes of removing the nitrogen group. And the amino group is the nitrogen group. So removing the nitrogen group from the amino acid. So what you end up having is the free amino group becomes ammonia, and what's left of the amino acid is referred to as the carbon skeleton. Now the ammonia is waste. That's nitrogenous waste. We convert it to urea, which then in the kidneys gets converted to urine, and we pee that out, of course. The carbon skeleton that's left over from the amino acid, that is what we can use to synthesize glucose or triglycerides for energy storage. So this slide shows you a specific amino acid, glutamic acid, getting broken down, but you could pretty much plug in any amino acid here, and this is what happens. The amino group gets ripped off, the nitrogen group gets ripped off, and you're left with a carbon skeleton that can become glucose or lipid, and this ammonia from the nitrogen that gets ripped off gets converted into urine and excreted. So there's a part in this chapter, if you haven't noticed already, I didn't really like the way this chapter was organized, so I reorganized it for my lecture. So I kind of am jumping around if you're following along in your book. You're probably flipping your pages a lot to be like, where is she? Where is this topic? So I am jumping around a little bit. There's also a few parts of the chapter I'm not really covering, and I'll do a little video lecture sort of going through the book as part of the test review, and I'll go over that then. But right now I want to talk, there's a section about food allergies. And it's basically just pointing out that a lot of the food allergies that are mentioned there, we've already talked about. Celiac disease is a gluten allergy. And we talked in general about what food allergies are. So I don't see a need to go over it again in this lecture. But the point of that section really is that the molecules in foods that cause allergies are all proteins. So gluten in wheat products is a protein. Casein in milk is a protein. That's what causes milk allergy. The chemical in peanuts that causes allergic reactions is a protein. So proteins are what elicit the type of molecule that elicit allergic reactions. So I guess that's what I want you to know from that section. Know that proteins are the macronutrient that are responsible for allergic responses or allergic reactions. Then there's PKU, phenylketonuria, which is an interesting condition which has to do with protein metabolism. So I really did want to talk about this one. It's a genetic condition. It's pretty rare, and people who have this condition can't process the essential amino acid phenylalanine. So when they eat foods that have phenylalanine builds up, and they break it down to some extent, but they can't completely process it, and the byproducts are toxic, and they build up in the tissues, particularly in the nervous tissue in the brain, and they can cause brain damage. And infants, I think it's law actually that all newborns be tested for PKU, because if you breastfeed or if you feed them formula, whatever, both of those contain phenylalanine, and if you're giving them lots of phenylalanine early in life and they're building brain damage in this critical developmental time for their brain, they can become severely sort of brain damaged in the first year of life. So PKU is commonly tested for in newborns, and if your baby is positive, does have phenylketonuria, then the treatment for it is to avoid foods with phenylalanine. So you'd have to use a special infant formula that's low in phenylalanine. And then when they're eating solid foods and as they get older, to maintain a low phenylalanine diet. So essentially, foods that are high in phenylalanine are foods that are high in protein. So any animal product, and some nuts and legumes, certain nuts and legumes. Wheat is also high in phenylalanine. Another thing that's really high in phenylalanine is aspartame, one of those, an alternative sweetener. So diet sodas, a lot of diet sodas are not okay for people with PKU, and they actually have any aspartame sweetened beverage has a warning label on it that says phenylketonurics, contains phenylalanine. It's like a big bold warning statement that don't drink this because it's high in phenylalanine. Aspartame is a protein, I guess. So that's the treatment. As long as you stay on a low phenylalanine diet, you don't get that brain damage. And it used to be thought that that the diet was unnecessary after a certain age, like after childhood, but more studies then showed that high phenylalanine diets after the age of 6 did show signs of like developmental delays or learning disabilities or things. So it's best for people with PKU to stay on low phenylalanine diets for the duration of their life. And there's a nice little blurb in the chapter about a boy, an adolescent boy who has PKU and how he, lives with it and works around it. And it just becomes a lifestyle, and he is very, used to it and knows what he can and can't eat and sticks to the diet for his health. So that's PKU. So the chapter also talks a lot, they have a whole section about nitrogen balance. And what is nitrogen balance? And it's really just a fancy way of saying that the body likes protein intake to be equal to protein turnover and protein excretion, okay? So you want to be at equilibrium, just like everything else in the body wants to be at some happy, optimal level. Same thing with protein. So a healthy adult is in nitrogen balance. They're losing as much protein as they are gaining or absorbing. Now, there are certain times in life where you need more protein, your body needs more protein, and so it's going to save and stock up on protein and excrete less. Okay, so those periods of time are anytime you're going through growth, whether it be like growth spurt, or whether it be muscle growth or recovery from an injury, pregnancy. All of those times your body will actually be in what's called positive nitrogen balance, where you are your body's keeping more protein than it's getting rid of. Likewise, there are situations where you are in negative nitrogen balance, where you're excreting more protein than you are intaking, and those are usually disease states. So if you have a fever or injury, if you're bleeding, if you have a kidney disease, etc. So you want to strive for nitrogen equilibrium. So how much protein do we actually need on a daily basis? What are our needs for protein? Well, the acceptable macronutrient range is one way to look at your protein needs. So you need 10 to 35% of your total calories to come from proteins. Another value for proteins is there is an RDA, there is a recommended daily allowance. There's an RDA for carbohydrates, which is 130 grams per day. And there's also an RDA for proteins. There is no RDA for fats. So the RDA for proteins is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. So I'm going to do a little calculation here. For a 150-pound person, 150 pounds converted to kilograms, I divide by 2.2, is 68 kilograms times 0.8 is 54.5. So that means that a 150-pound person needs about 55 grams of protein a day to meet the recommended daily allowance or dietary allowance. So you can do that for yourself if you'd like. Grab a calculator, take your weight in pounds, divide it by 2.2, and then multiply that number by 0.8, and that'll tell you how many grams of protein you need per day. Unless you are unless you're a strength athlete or an endurance, unless you're training for a marathon or you go to the gym like at least 4, maybe 5 times a week, that would be increase your protein needs. If you're someone who's building endurance and building muscle, that increases your protein needs about 2-fold. If you're like a professional weightlifter, bodybuilder, that will increase your protein needs about 2 times. So also during periods of growth, our protein needs are slightly higher. You'll see that when we get to the chapter on nutrition during the life cycle, that protein needs in children are a little bit high, and especially during adolescence. So here's a little chart from my old textbook telling you, sort of comparing the protein needs of a normal average adult to those who are strength training or endurance training. And it also points out the difference between intakes for non-vegetarians and vegetarians. So you'll notice that if you look here, these yellow bars, so the non-vegetarian strength athletes need 1.6 to 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, which is about twice as much as the average person needs. Whereas a vegetarian strength athlete needs a little bit more, 1.7 to 1.8. So it's not a big difference there, but we'll talk about why there is a difference. It has to do with the quality of protein sources. So what's interesting is that in the current Western American diet, most Americans actually get 1.5 to 2 times the recommended dietary allowance for protein already without even trying. Even if you're not conscious of your protein intake, if you're getting the right amount of calories a day, you're probably getting, or actually a lot of Americans are probably getting more than the number of calories they need, which is probably another reason why they're getting more protein than they need. But we also have a very meat-centric diet, and meat is a very good source of protein, very rich source of protein. So if you thought that you weren't getting enough protein in your diet, double check your diet analysis, because a lot of people are often surprised that their protein requirements are met. So where do we get proteins in our diet? Well, the best sources of proteins are animal products. Meat and dairy are very rich sources of protein. But we also get protein from a lot of plant foods. Legumes, so beans, different types of beans, and peanuts are also considered legumes. Whole grains like whole wheat bread, whole rye, any whole grain, and also nuts and seeds provide a fair amount of protein as well. But there's differences in the quality of the protein from these different foods. So animal proteins tend to be complete proteins or high quality proteins, while plant proteins tend to be incomplete or low quality proteins. So an incomplete protein is a protein a food that lacks one or more essential amino acids. Okay. Alternatively, it can be a food that has the amino acids that are necessary, but the proteins in that food are very difficult to digest, potentially because there's a lot of fiber or phytochemicals that block digestion or absorption of those proteins. So maybe they contain the essential amino acids, biochemically, but we don't actually digest and absorb them in our GI tract. So we consider them deficient in those essential amino acids. So again, plant foods, most plant sources of proteins, nuts, grains, legumes, those are all incomplete or low quality proteins. They're lacking in one or more essential amino acid. Meats and dairy, animal foods, animal products are all complete high quality proteins. They contain all of the essential amino acids in the amounts that are appropriate for our body. There's also a couple of vegetarian sources of complete proteins. Soy protein is very complete. This is different than if you just eat soybeans. Soybeans are really classified up here in the legumes, but there's a lot of methods to extract soy protein and process it and make products like tofu and tempeh and miso, all of these different soy protein products, okay? Those are all complete proteins. They contain all of the essential amino acids and are often used in vegetarian foods as a meat substitute, partly because they are complete proteins just as good as animal products are, and also because they can be flavored or textured or things to sort of resemble meat texture in some way. So they're very often used in vegetarian sort of substitute, vegetarian dishes as a meat substitute. That's what I was looking for. Quinoa, I don't know how many of you have heard of quinoa, but quinoa is a grain. It's kind of like couscous. I don't know how many people have had couscous. Maybe I should bring that in sometime, even though I'm not going to be in anymore. Quinoa and couscous are both grains. They're kind of like rice. When you cook them, you can cook them kind of like rice. Both quinoa and couscous, they're like little tiny balls of grain, and you boil them, and they absorb the water, and they're like similar rice dishes. Whatever you throw into a rice dish, you could throw in with quinoa, and season it, and add some like stir-fry vegetables, or serve it with fish or something as a side with fish, if you're a vegetarian, I guess you're just using it as like a grain to add some carbohydrates to your meal, but it also happens to be a source of complete protein. And it is rising in popularity, so you can get it at any grocery store. It used to be kind of a specialty food that you would get from like Nori's or some other like health food store, but now you can get it at pretty much any grocery store. So just because you are eating incomplete, if you're eating nuts, grains, and legumes, foods that lack in essential amino acids, you can turn incomplete proteins into complete proteins by combining them in complementary ways. So a complementary combination is made by eating two incomplete proteins together that together they provide all of the essential amino acids. So an example I like is here, beans and rice, which is like actually a classic dish that maybe who knows if someone way back when realized that it somehow made a complete protein. But beans are limited in methionine and cysteine. Okay, methionine is essential amino acid. Cysteine is conditionally essential. And rice is limited in lysine. So rice is limited in lysine, but it has lots of methionine and cysteine. And beans are limited in methionine and cysteine, but they have plenty of lysine. So you eat them together, and suddenly you have all of your 9 essential amino acids. So you have a complete protein. So this is called complementary combinations. And this can be good for vegetarians who are trying to get their complete proteins without eating animal products. And it can also be good for individuals who do eat meat, but just as a way of making sure that you're getting all of your proteins, all of your essential amino acids. So here's a little chart from your book, and if we were in class, we would sort of work this together. But I guess I'll work out some examples. I'll give you a minute to do it yourself, but try to think of some complementary combinations you can have between legumes, grains, and seeds and tree nuts. So legumes are limited in methionine and tryptophan, but grains and seeds are limited in lysine. So try to think of some combinations of legumes with grains or legumes with seeds and tree nuts. Okay, some that I'm thinking of are peanut butter on whole grain bread or a whole grain bagel. Okay, that would be a complementary combination. Another one somebody gave me in class today, peas and rice. That's kind of a classic dish. I think of it more for babies, but I still think it's delicious. Peas and rice would be a complementary combination. Also, like to do legumes plus seeds and tree nuts, some kind of a trail mix where you have peanuts and cashews and almonds and sunflower seeds. So mixing peanuts with other types of tree nuts gives you a complete protein. So there's a lot of different types of combinations you can make. So feel free to come up with some of your own. But for now, I'll move on. So when it comes to protein quality and getting the right amount of essential amino acids, a lot of people think that vegetarians don't get enough protein and don't get enough of the essential amino acids, which is complete myth and completely false, because there's plenty of foods that contain protein that are not animal products. And by doing complementary combinations, you can get your complete proteins, all your essential amino acids, into a vegetarian diet. So anyone who thinks that vegetarian diets are not healthy, you're wrong. They can be very healthy. But we will talk about some of the disadvantages or some of the dangers of some of the stricter vegetarian type diets, like vegan diets. So vegetarian is just a general term for a diet that restricts foods that are from plant products. Okay, so usually you're cutting out any type of animal product, but there's different levels of vegetarianism. So some people, call themselves a semi-vegetarian, where they just don't eat red meat. So they'll eat fish and poultry, and eggs and dairy, but they won't eat red meat. And then there's people who won't eat any kind of animal meat. They won't kill animals for food, but they're okay with like eggs and milk, and other animal food products, other dairy products, etc. And then it goes all the way down to the vegans, the different types of vegans, which really, they cut out every kind of animal food. So no dairy, no meat, no eggs. I've also heard of vegans not eating honey because bees make honey, so it's technically an animal product. Things like that. So they can become very, very strict and restrictive. So just as there's lots of different types of vegetarian diets, there's also a lot of different reasons for keeping those diets. So some people do it for health. There are health benefits we'll discuss to vegetarianism. Some people do it for preference. They just don't like meat, or certain types of meat, so they stay away from them. Some people do it for ethical reasons. They think because of the treatment of animals in the meat production industry, or just because they are animal lovers and they don't like the idea of killing animals and eating them. There can be religious reasons for being a vegetarian, ecological reasons, so mass production of these huge farms where they call them feeding lots for cattle, for like big industry meat producers, and there's a lot of runoff from those factories that contaminate water sources. A lot of the E. coli infections and salmonella infections that we see in produce are from runoff from these different types of facilities. Also, all the methane gas that's produced by cattle in those facilities contributes to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and global warming. So there's actually a lot of damage done to our planet by the meat packaging and meat raising industries, not so much like the local farms who do it, but like industrial sized farms. So there's a lot of reasons for becoming a vegetarian and a lot of different ways to be a vegetarian, I suppose. So what are some of the health benefits and I guess health risks of vegetarianism? Well, most of the studies say that being a vegetarian and being on some kind of a vegetarian diet is most likely to benefit your health. Vegetarians have a reduced risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and certain types of cancer. These are all well documented. If you look at two different populations, the ones that eat more plant foods have lower risk of a lot of chronic diseases. Now, that brings up the question too, is it their diet or is it their lifestyle? Because people who eat healthier probably also live healthier lifestyles. So that's a little food for thought for you. But still, there's a lot of benefits, added benefits to eating more plants and less animals. Some of the advantages are more micronutrients, more vitamins and minerals, namely vitamin C, folic acid, magnesium, potassium, are all vitamins and minerals that are very rich in plant foods and are really non-existent in animal foods. Phytochemicals you can only get from plant foods. Fiber you can only get from plant foods. And grain, plant foods. Also, plant foods are lower in saturated fat and cholesterol and higher in polyunsaturated fats. So those are very beneficial as well. Sorry, I'll be right back. Heartburn. I'm sure you wanted to know that. Okay, so some of the disadvantages of really very strict vegan diets, because most vegetarians still include some animal products like milk or eggs and can still get a lot of these nutrients, but particularly people who are on strict vegan diets have to be careful that they are making sure that they're getting adequate amounts of these different vitamins and minerals and nutrients. Particularly vitamins B12, D, and riboflavin. B12 is also in a lot of fortified grains, so if you eat cereals or fortified grain products, you can easily get your vitamin B12. Vitamin D, really there aren't a lot of sources of vitamin D that are not in animal products, except for sunlight. You can actually generate vitamin D upon sun exposure. So if you get plenty of sun or take a vitamin D supplement. Zinc, iron, and calcium, high in meats and milk. So if you're not eating those things, these minerals are often, there's a lot of plant sources of those minerals, but they're not as, your body doesn't absorb these minerals as well from plants. So something to consider. Omega-3 fatty acids. Richest source is fish, so if you're not eating fish, make sure you're getting a plant source. Flaxseed is an excellent source of omega-3 fatty acids, so that can be for anyone. It can add those to their diet, but particularly vegans might want to consider incorporating those. And certain essential amino acids. It's really important that vegetarians have a balanced and adequate diet, that they plan complementary combinations of different types, that they're getting a balance of different food groups within the plant foods, and that they're eating enough of them so that they get enough calories and that they get enough of these limited micronutrients. But otherwise, it's a perfectly healthy diet for people. So when it comes to our protein needs, we want to make sure that we're getting enough of our proteins, but we also want to make sure we're not getting too much. So we're going to talk about the effects of too much protein versus too little protein. So excessive protein intake does have some detrimental consequences, particularly if your excessive protein intake is because you're eating lots of meat or animal products. So diets that are high in protein generally are diets that are high in animal products. And those diets are associated with increased risk of heart disease and also increased risk of certain cancers. So you want to watch out there. Also, getting too much protein in your diet can lead to dehydration because excess protein draws in water into your blood, and then all of that gets excreted as urine. And finally, excess protein intake is particularly dangerous for people who have liver or kidney disease because those are the two organs that are mainly responsible for processing excess protein and excreting it. So if your liver and your kidney are not functioning very well, and then you're giving them all this protein to process, it's going to stress them out and cause even more issues with those organs. So people who have, particularly those who have kidney disease, are told to watch their protein intake, to have low protein diets because it can exacerbate kidney disease. If you're a healthy person with a healthy liver and healthy kidney, excess protein intake, there's no evidence that suggests that excess protein can damage those organs. But if those organs are already injured or diseased, you don't want to overstress them. Protein deficiency, the other side of the story, is fairly uncommon in Americans in our Western diet. Okay, it's more common amongst people who are very old and who are on fixed incomes and can't always afford food or aren't hungry because as you get older, your taste buds start to die, and elderly people often are notorious for not eating well, for not having poor appetite. So sometimes it's from that, sometimes it's from not being able to afford food. Also in young children, particularly if they are young vegan children. Vegan diets for children can be healthy, but you have to make sure that they're getting enough energy, and you have to make sure that they're getting enough protein and enough of their different vitamins, just like for adults. But the difference is that children tend to eat less food, so making sure that they're getting enough of their needs from their vegan diet, you really have to plan it carefully. And if they're not getting enough protein, you'll know it because their growth will be stunted. You watch their growth charts, and if they're not growing as much as they should be, they're probably not getting enough protein. So the bigger problem is worldwide with protein energy malnutrition disorders. So these are in third world countries where they're not only not getting enough protein, but a lot of times not getting enough food, period, not getting enough calories. So there's two different types of protein energy malnutrition that we're going to talk about, kwashiorkor and marasmus. So marasmus is actually the term for starvation, for not getting enough energy. So chronically starved, chronically energy deprived. And kwashiorkor is a more specific protein deficiency. It's a form of undernutrition where children are getting the right amount of calories but not the right amount of protein. Okay, so protein in their diets usually comes from breast milk. So what happens in kwashiorkor usually is you have these children who are breastfed and they're getting enough protein from breast milk, but then they get weaned from the breast milk when they get a little bit older, and they get put on these diets that are very low in protein, and like a watery rice cereal that is very low in protein. And they're still growing, though. They're still in a period of growth through childhood that they have very high protein needs, and they're not getting complete high quality sources of protein in their diet anymore. So they're lacking in essential proteins, and their body actually starts so this picture here, these two children in front, these would be examples of children who have marasmus. They're just very thin everywhere. You can see their rib cage. You can see the bones in their arms. Their necks are very thin, okay? But this little boy in back here, he's got this big swollen belly. This would be a child with kwashiorkor, okay? And kwashiorkor has this very distinct pathology where you get this distension of the belly. And I remember watching like infomercials, when I was a kid for those, like, adopt a kid in Africa, and it showed all these pictures of these starving children. They were really skinny arms and legs, but they had these big bellies, and I always thought, they're not starving, look how fat they are. But they're not fat, it's actually fluid retention, because remember, not enough protein in the diet, low protein in the blood causes edema, swelling. So they can get swelling, particularly in the abdomen, but also in the legs and feet. They get this swelling. So there's a picture in your book of a child similar who has that same sort of shows that same swollen belly feature of kwashiorkor. Okay, also causes a reddening or discoloration of the hair because the hair is dependent on protein. So you can have issues with hair color and that typical swelling. So that is. And then a lot of times they're also losing muscle mass, so their legs and arms are usually very skinny because they have no muscle, because their body is breaking down their muscle tissue in order to get proteins to do important functions like breathe and live. So it sacrifices the muscle tissue in order to have the brain and heart and stuff function. So the last part of the chapter talks about proteins for athletes. And there's a lot of, this is supposed to be animated, but oh well, my answer's already available. So my question is, yes, athletes need more protein because they're building muscle, but does excess protein increase muscle mass? And this is this is a huge, like, billion-dollar industry of selling protein supplements to weightlifters and bodybuilders and athletes, okay? But it's actually a big fat myth. The only way to increase muscle mass is to make sure you're getting enough calories to fuel building muscles, and also you have to be doing resistance training. The more training you do, the more muscle you build. And taking protein supplements is not, if anything, the way it helps you build muscle is by providing more calories to build the muscle with. But it doesn't actually increase your muscle mass. Eating enough protein, which is easy to do with your diet, you actually don't need that much. And eating enough carbohydrates to fuel. If you don't eat, a lot of athletes and bodybuilders make the mistake of putting too much focus on proteins, eating a lot of protein and not eating a lot of carbohydrate. And they get tired faster. If they don't have enough carbohydrates, they can't fuel their training. And they get tired faster, they don't recover as fast, and they don't build as much muscle, because carbohydrates are really important too. So making sure you get enough protein, but there's really no need for excess protein supplements. That's kind of a myth. And if some protein supplements actually contain individual amino acids, which can actually be dangerous, because getting excess amounts of specific or certain amino acids can actually be toxic, can cause imbalances in your amino acid pool. And we all know that the key sort of in nutrition and in homeostasis is to balance things, balance our nutrients. Amino acids naturally occur in certain proportions, I guess, naturally. So if you're taking excess of certain amino acids, that can put your body in a state of unbalance. Certain amino acids are really high, and that can actually be harmful. So save your money and don't take protein supplements. So the last thing I like to do, of course, is to do a little critical thinking. I like this NutriCase from my other textbook. Theo is a basketball player, and he is talking about becoming the potential of athletes being vegetarians, okay? So he says, "No way would I ever become a vegetarian. The only way to build up your muscles is to eat meat. I was reading in a bodybuilding magazine last week about some guy who doesn't eat anything from animals, not even milk or eggs, and he looked pretty buff. But I don't believe it. They can do anything to photos these days. Besides, during basketball season, I just crave red meat. If I don't have it, I feel sort of like my batteries don't get charged. It's just not practical for a competitive athlete to go without meat." Now, do you think that, so what two claims does Theo make here about the role of red meat in his diet. So he claims that he needs it for energy, that his batteries don't get recharged, and that you need it for being a competitive athlete, I guess, and building muscle. He says that the only way to build muscles is to eat meat. So do you think those claims are valid? Hopefully you said no. No, you don't need meat to build muscle. You need protein to build muscle. And you need to weightlift or do exercise to build muscle. And you also need carbohydrates to fuel that weightlifting and to fuel that muscle growth. So you don't need to get that protein from meat. And there are lots of vegetarian and vegan athletes, and even vegetarian and vegan bodybuilders. So it is very possible to get by without meat. What facts might be important to consider about the nature of plant and animal proteins in your diet as an athlete? The quality of them, right? So if you're an athlete and you are eating any food, and you're eating any protein, you want to go for complete proteins. So either animal proteins, which are great complete proteins, which is why meat is so sort of tied to building muscles in athletes. But also you can get complete proteins from plants. Soy protein, so like tofu, tempeh, those are all good complete plant-based proteins. Quinoa, we talked about, and also doing complementary combinations of different plant foods to get your complete proteins. So you can be a perfectly healthy and perfectly buff vegetarian athlete. And this last slide here is the concept check, some of the concept checks from the chapter. And normally in class I would call you guys out and have you go over them. I'm not going to answer them myself. I'm going to let you guys go through and do that from the lecture notes or from your textbook. But it's a good way to sort of review the chapter. In fact, I suggest doing most of the concept checks in the chapter. The ones I pick out are the ones I think are the most key. And in this chapter, of course, there were some sections I said don't even worry about, so you don't need to do them all, but work your way through these. And your tests will be coming up. I'm going to do a video, just a little video review for the test. That is on chapters 5, 6, and 7, all the macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So I hope that you enjoyed this lecture, and sayonara.